When Donkey Kong Country was released and proved a phenomenal success, Rare became known as the premier developer for Nintendo consoles going forward. While they had their share of success with the Killer Instinct franchise around the same time, the British developer was viewed in the eyes of many players as the company responsible for developing future games in the Donkey Kong franchise. The Donkey Kong Country series would receive a new installment on an annual basis for the Super Nintendo alongside the Donkey Kong Land series for the Game Boy. Donkey Kong became one of the hottest video game brands at the time with its constant flow of new games and merchandise. The franchise even produced a computer-animated television series that first aired in France in 1996 and would later be released in North America and Japan. Not long after Donkey Kong's meteoric rise in the video game industry, Nintendo released its next-generation console, the Nintendo 64. It wasn't long before players anticipated how Rare would evolve Donkey Kong to make the leap into the third dimension on the N64. The first Donkey Kong game players received was not only a different genre for the franchise, but a game that originated far beyond the world of Donkey Kong. This game began from a concept created by a team of 4 developers at Rare. Lee Musgrave would be in charge of the art, Rob Harrison was the chief programmer, Lee Schuneman served as the game's director, and the project was overseen by Chris Stamper. They initially worked on a real-time strategy game for the Nintendo 64 with a caveman time travel theme. This project didn't last long and was soon abandoned, so the team set out once more to look for an interesting idea. According to Lee Schuneman, the initial vision for the game was far from clear. To the team, it became a series of iterations trying different things until they got an interesting approach. They began to look at creating a fun racing game using some of their early RTS assets, such as woolly mammoths, to populate the game in its early stages of development. When the idea for a fun racer was brought up, the team members' fond memories of playing Super Mario Kart for the Super Nintendo came to mind. Not long after, the team began spending hours playing the game, and the racing element would go on to become a big influence on their own game. For further inspiration, the team looked beyond the game industry and took inspirations from Disney World. The initial design of the Adventure World was based around a theme park and evolved from there. The team of 4 worked around the idea of using a central hub area that interlinked worlds, offering discovery and adventure akin to platform games, but played out with racing. When it came to the overall game design and world layout, the ideas brought forth by Schuneman would be created with the express purpose of realizing his eclectic visions of individualistic level design. Each location was designed around a general theme, but then each racetrack made within that theme was very different in style, so the player would always want to see what was next, an idea stemming from the initial theme park concept. By separating the central world into subworlds containing individual levels, the game allowed for these artistic and enthusiastic ideas, which would never realistically coexist, to be included while maintaining the illusion of a single solid world. Under their limited manpower, their initial design for the project was tentatively called Wild Cartoon Kingdom. After the project gained momentum and a team was built up to develop it, Wild Cartoon Kingdom evolved into Adventure Racers. Other people who were brought onto the development team included Kevin Bayliss, who served as the game's art director and designed the main characters, Paul Mountain, who was appointed to senior programmer, and Martin Wakely also worked on the game after finishing work on Blast Corps. At the beginning of production, Schuneman was fortunate enough to receive much creative freedom on the project without the hindrance of designing the game to fit a prior template. There was no involvement from Nintendo in terms of content, which gave the team free rein to add a lot of unique content to their game. For instance, during development, they decided to add a mirror mode of the entire game, which resulted in doubling the available content. For this game, the team developed a set of tools that were designed exclusively by the company that would not even be used by Nintendo. This was known as Specular Highlighting and Real-Time Dynamic Animation, or simply RDA, a tool that allowed all the team members to work on the game simultaneously, which proved to be incredibly beneficial during the development process. The game had a development cycle of around 14 months, with the main thrust of the development cycle taking up around 9 months. But for the development team, it was such a fun and inspiring experience seeing what they were able to do with the graphics and gameplay that they would always look forward to working on the project every day. Shuneman described the experience as being surrounded by loads of people who were really new to making games but also really passionate about making a great fun game and not knowing any better. Still, the game's title and release date wasn't final until a few months before its completion. In June of 1997 at E3, Lee Shuneman demoed the game to Shigeru Miyamoto of Nintendo. At this time, the title for the game was going to be Pro-Am 64, a sequel to the original NES game RC Pro-Am. In fact, in its current form, the game reportedly didn't even feature cars but instead vehicles similar to three-wheel tricycles. Shigeru Miyamoto was so impressed by what he saw that he offered the game one of Nintendo's own lead mascots, Diddy Kong. At first, the team back at Rare who had been working on Pro-Am 64 didn't like the idea of using one of Nintendo's characters in their game, even though it was Rare who originally created Diddy Kong. However, they later gave in to the offer and the new title for the game would now be Diddy Kong Racing. The Donkey Kong brand would prove to be very beneficial to their game at its release. In 1997, Nintendo's big holiday game release was supposed to be Banjo-Kazooie, but when it was delayed until next year, Diddy Kong Racing was moved into its newly emptied position, which resulted in the game receiving a big marketing campaign that was backed by Nintendo. Leading up to its release, Nintendo conducted a $20 million marketing campaign for the game. According to reports, $2 million was dedicated to print media and $10 million was spent on a promotional campaign with Taco Bell. Diddy Kong Racing set an industry record of 125,000 pre-order reservations. These were attributed to Nintendo sending hundreds of VHS tapes containing footage of Diddy Kong Racing to players across North America using a program similar to their past big releases like Star Fox 64 and Donkey Kong Country. Diddy Kong Racing would finally be released for the Nintendo 64 in November of 1997. Despite Diddy Kong's name in the title, the game's premise mostly focused around a brand new set of characters. At the beginning of the game, an evil wizard named Wizpig is attempting to take over the island of Timber the Tiger while his parents are on vacation. To assist him in battling Wizpig, Timber recruits his old friend Diddy Kong along with his other friends Bumper the Badger, Conker the Squirrel, Tip Top the Turtle, Drumstick the Rooster, Pipsy the Mouse, Banjo the Bear, Crunch the Critter, and TT the Stopwatch. Diddy Kong Racing was a game that combined the gameplay of both Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64. The racing element would only make up half of the game, while the other half was designed around an adventure mode. Using any of the characters, the player had to complete a number of races under different circumstances, such as finishing first, collecting various items along the way, or battling against a number of challenging boss characters. There were different race types spread across the 5 worlds: Dino Domain, Snowflake Mountain, Sherbert Island, Dragon Forest, and Future Funland, each of which had its own unique set of racetracks. Depending on the racetrack, the player could choose to control either a car, hovercraft, or plane within a race. The game featured a lot of technical features not seen in many early games for the Nintendo 64, such as recorded voices for many of the characters, and music that would change in mood while remaining in tempo based on the location of the player, a feature that would continue to be seen in future games by Rare. David Wise was brought on to work on the game's soundtrack alongside Graham Norgate, who served as the sound designer. Many who played Diddy Kong Racing would recall how the soundtrack provided a number of catchy and memorable tunes throughout the game. According to David Wise, he was unashamedly paying tribute to some of the great Nintendo compositions from Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64. In fact, for inspiration throughout development, the team would listen to a lot of the music that was featured in Mario Kart. While composing the soundtrack, David Wise was trying to design types of music that embodied the genre, laying reference to every cliché he could. He described his approach as trying to be more Nintendo than Nintendo, but in a very complimentary and respectful way. Diddy Kong Racing was received positively from the gaming press as well as the players, though it wasn't long before many came to the consensus that the game was simply a clone of Nintendo's own Mario Kart 64, which came out less than a year ago. However, it also started the debate over which game was truly superior. In terms of graphics and sound, Diddy Kong Racing was superior to Mario Kart 64 since it featured polygonal models and backgrounds and a higher quality soundtrack. There were features included in Diddy Kong Racing that many felt made the game superior, while there were others who felt that those same qualities actually made the game inferior. For example, Diddy Kong Racing featured an item system which had an upgrade mechanic, while Mario Kart 64's items had more variety. Mario Kart 64 had a more limited single-player option, while Diddy Kong Racing had an entire adventure mode. However, that same adventure mode was commonly criticized for featuring a lot of repetitive modes that too often detracted from the racing element and thus resulted in tedium for the players. Plus, as a multiplayer-focused game, the options available in Mario Kart 64 were much more enjoyable than the ones offered in Diddy Kong Racing. Despite some issues that could be had with Diddy Kong Racing or Mario Kart 64, many agree that each game had enough of its own merits to make both worth owning. With Nintendo's heavy marketing and high praise among players, Diddy Kong Racing sold 800,000 copies in 2 weeks before the Christmas of 1997. This made it the fastest-selling video game at the time and earned it a place in the Guinness Book of World Records. Due to the game reportedly selling out almost immediately during its North American launch, Nintendo shipped over 1 million units of the game and shipped 2 million more units by the first quarter of 1998. Diddy Kong Racing would go on to sell over 4.5 million copies worldwide, which would make it the 8th best-selling Nintendo 64 game of all time. The game also took home the Console Racing Trophy at the 1999 Interactive Achievement Awards. While Rare's game probably would have still received critical success if it had originally been released as Pro-Am 64, it probably wouldn't have achieved the same commercial success as it would being known as Diddy Kong Racing. Instead, it was designed as a possible launching point for characters in many of Rare's future games. For instance, Diddy Kong Racing had the first appearance of Banjo and Conker, who would both go on to star in their own games, while others would go on to make cameo appearances. Looking back on the game, many could critique Diddy Kong Racing as being too large or a product of unbridled enthusiasm during production. But to Lee Shuneman, the emotion of pure enthusiasm from the team that created the game shines through in the final product. From the cute characters with silly voices, to the bright colors that looked like a child had been let loose on a paintboard. With a company like Rare behind them, the development team didn't fear the unknown, but rather pressed on with passion for their lofty aspirations. And with games like Diddy Kong Racing, many fans had begun to see Rare as evolving from perfecting other people's innovations to creating its own. After the success of Diddy Kong Racing, Rare began development on a number of kart racing games starring Mickey Mouse that were co-published by Nintendo and Disney Interactive. The first game released was Mickey's Racing Adventure on the Game Boy Color in November 1999. This was followed up by Mickey Speedway USA, which was released on the Nintendo 64 in the fall of 2000 and the Game Boy Color in March of 2001. These games featured a cast consisting of various Disney characters in a racing game similar in design to Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing. They were also developed by lead designers at Rare who previously worked on Diddy Kong Racing, like Lee Shuneman and Martin Wakely. In fact, despite what many people may believe, Mickey Speedway USA was actually made by most of the same team who previously worked on Jet Force Gemini, and even used the same engine to design the game. After the Nintendo 64 was released, the wait began for Rare to release a brand new Donkey Kong game for the system. While players had received spin-off games like Diddy Kong Racing and platform games like Banjo-Kazooie, fans still anticipated the next game from Rare where Donkey Kong would return in the starring role. While many N64 owners were busy playing a number of Rare's other new games for the console, another development team was being formed to work on the next big Donkey Kong game. It became known under a number of different code names like Ultra Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Country 64 before it reached its official title, Donkey Kong 64. Following his work on Banjo-Kazooie, senior designer George Andreas was to head the team for Donkey Kong 64, while Greg Mayles stayed to work on Banjo-Tooie. The game was originally being developed to be used with Nintendo's planned disk drive expansion for the N64. Had it been developed with this format in mind, one of the features that would have been possible included being able to link the game with Banjo-Kazooie to exchange data between cartridges. That way, Banjo and Kazooie could have appeared in Donkey Kong 64, while Donkey Kong could have appeared in Banjo-Kazooie. But with the expansion drive facing numerous delays from Nintendo, this format for the game was cancelled, as was this feature. The game would instead take advantage of another accessory in the works for the Nintendo 64, the expansion pack. The expansion pack added an additional 4 megabytes of data to the Nintendo 64, which would give it a total of 8 megabytes of RAM. When the accessory was first released for the system in 1998, it was promoted as an optional add-on that would only alter a select number of games on the N64 by enhancing the graphics, boosting performance, or unlocking extra content. With Donkey Kong 64, however, it would be released with the expansion pack included, as it would become the first game to require the accessory in order to play the game. Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong would make their return as playable characters, but they were also joined by 3 brand new characters for a total of 5 playable characters. While the Donkey Kong Country series was known for adding new characters with each installment, it seemed like Donkey Kong 64 would be continuing the tradition without acknowledging some of the previous main characters. The 3 new playable characters consisted of an orangutan named Lanky, a chimpanzee named Tiny, and a large gorilla named Chunky. The latter 2 characters' similar appearance to Dixie Kong and Kiddy Kong had many fans confused why Rare would decide to create these 2 characters instead of just bringing back the ones they already had. There were conflicting reports surrounding this decision, such as the belief that Donkey Kong Country 3's unimpressive sales signaled the unpopularity of the main characters featured, but as it was too late in development for drastic changes, it was simply noted that Tiny and Chunky were also related to the missing duo. Evelyn Fisher was originally planned to work on the soundtrack after finishing Donkey Kong Country 3, but Grant Kirkhope was later asked to help work on the compositions. Despite already working on a number of other projects at the time, like Banjo-Tooie and Perfect Dark, Grant Kirkhope eventually took charge of Donkey Kong 64's soundtrack as well. While composing the game's soundtrack, Grant Kirkhope didn't want to ruin the themes composed by David Wise in the Donkey Kong Country series. Instead, he viewed Donkey Kong 64 as a much darker game than the Banjo-Kazooie series and took a few more risks when composing the game's music. Continuing in the tradition of having the characters in their games being voiced by the developers, Grant Kirkhope would also provide the voice for Donkey Kong himself.
Donkey Kong.
Nintendo of America announced that Donkey Kong 64 would have an advertising campaign worth over $12 million. Nintendo partnered with several companies to market Donkey Kong 64, began running a nationwide bus tour, and even produced a collectible card game that was made available in Japan. In North America, Nintendo produced a promotional videotape advertising Donkey Kong 64 that was combined with a promotion for Rare's other big release that year, Jet Force Gemini.
Okay, he's big, he's bad, he's back, and he's still wearing that tie. Can you say full-on 3D adventure spectacular? Can you say expansion pack blowout mind-blowing graphics? Another future game of the year from Rare? How about just Kremlings? Looking bad for you guys. I mean it. Your lunch meat, your toast, you're out of there. You're gone to history. After a strong marketing push and a development period that reportedly lasted around 2.5 years,
Donkey Kong 64 became one of the most wanted games coming to the Nintendo 64. The game was finally released in North America on November 24, 1999, and in the following weeks in Europe and Japan. Donkey Kong 64 played similar in design to Super Mario 64 and Rare's Banjo-Kazooie, but with its own additions and revisions to the platform game formula. The player would start the game as Donkey Kong, who must first rescue the other 4 main characters before they were made playable. Many familiar faces from Donkey Kong Country returned in various supporting roles, with the main antagonist once again being King K. Rool. There was a main hub world with DK Isles, an island once again in the shape of Donkey Kong's head, and 7 new areas to explore such as Jungle Japes, Angry Aztec, Frantic Factory, Gloomy Galleon, Fungi Forest, Crystal Caves, and Creepy Castle. In each diverse area, the player would solve various objectives to earn golden bananas that would grant them access to the next level. Players explored each level as a single character, but could swap between the others through tag barrels scattered throughout an area. The number of collectible items in the game was much larger than what was seen in Rare's past games. With each new area, characters were able to learn new abilities and receive artillery ranging from fruit-dispensing weapons to magical musical instruments. There was always something new to be discovered in each area, whether it be a boss battle, a racing mode ranging from the classic minecart to various other vehicles, or a number of random bonus mini-games in the spirit of the Donkey Kong Country series. There was even the inclusion of the classic Donkey Kong arcade game from Nintendo and even Rare's first video game, Jetpack, which players had to complete a number of times to progress in the game. All of this made Donkey Kong 64 one of the biggest games Rare had ever produced and one of their longest games to complete. And if that wasn't enough for players, there was even a fully featured multiplayer mode for up to 4 players featuring a number of modes found in the single-player game. When it was first released, Donkey Kong 64 received very positive reviews from critics and a strong reception from players. While the game wasn't regarded as a graphical revolution in the same way as its predecessor was on the Super Nintendo, many people were instead impressed by the seemingly endless amount of content and available game modes that were put into the game. The game's multiplayer mode was regarded as nothing to get very excited about, but the main single-player game showed how Rare's ambition when it came to its development was pure volume. Donkey Kong 64 would go on to sell over 5 million copies worldwide, making it the 7th best-selling Nintendo 64 game of all time. The game was awarded the title of Game of the Year by Nintendo Power Magazine, and also nominated for Console Game of the Year and Overall Game of the Year by the 2000 Interactive Achievement Awards.
Here we go.
Donkey Kong 64 had the trademark character and personality of Rare's prior games in full force, but for some players, this proved to become more infamous than well received. While many had come to view Donkey Kong 64's brand of humor in one way or another, there was one music track that a number of people felt really detracted from the experience. At the beginning of the game, players were treated to a rap song composed by Grant Kirkhope discussing each of the main characters in the game. While the game's overall soundtrack was considered up to par with Rare's high standards, this rap song, simply known as the DK rap, has become a part of the game that both players and the developers wish had never come into existence.
When she needs to be, she can go through the air and climb up trees. If you choose her, you'll not choose wrong. With a skip and a hop, she's one cool car.
Over the years, Grant Kirkhope has received a lot of flack for his involvement in creating the infamous DK rap. He's gone on record to say that the song was supposed to be a joke and not an attempt at making a serious rap song. Grant Kirkhope also claims that the DK rap was originally the idea of George Andreas, who wrote the lyrics and was one of the song's rappers alongside fellow lead designer Chris Sutherland, also known as the voice of Killer Instinct.
Crazy car, just digs this tune. Come on, cranky, take it to the fridge. Walnuts, peanuts, pineapple smells, grapes, melons, oranges, and coconut shells. Oh yeah, walnuts, peanuts, pineapple smells, grapes, melons, oranges, and coconut shells.
I apologize for the Donkey Kong rap. It's officially on video now. I apologise for that piece of music. You know, I didn't think it was that bad at the time. Please forgive me. Please let me off. Somebody, please. That's it.
Donkey Kong 64 remains one of the most successful games in Rare's entire history. However, as more time has passed, many of those who once played it have since come out and begun criticizing many of the game's design choices. Things that were once viewed as ambitious in terms of scope and game design have now come to represent some of the worst parts of Rare's legacy of games. For many, the problem in Donkey Kong 64 started with the fact that there were 5 different playable characters. While they each had their own separate abilities and objectives in the game, the fact that they were so individualized would prove to be detrimental to the entire game's flow. For example, each character had to collect their own set of items within each level to progress in the game. Now, this is a common feature with 3D platformers in general, but it's also remained manageable because it's normally done with a single character. So when the number of items to collect was multiplied by 5, it made Donkey Kong 64 become more tedious as a result. With the increase in items to collect, the player's objectives for collecting the majority of these items were not always creative or even that memorable. The inclusion of so many available weapons, abilities, and play modes could have added to the game's variety, but were so barely used in a compelling nature that they would instead come off feeling unnecessary or wasted. Many players felt as though the designers of the game during its long development cycle had forgotten what had made their company's prior platform games so appealing to begin with. To them, it wasn't the idea of collecting items and abilities for the sake of collecting more items and abilities that made Rare's games so great. Instead, it was the inspired level designs and inventive game mechanics that made their games stand out, something that Donkey Kong 64 tried to do, but with underwhelming results. Many who had come to despise Donkey Kong 64's design philosophy have even argued that one of the game's only redeeming values was the fact that it included one of the best emulations of the original Donkey Kong arcade game. But as divisive as the game may have become, Donkey Kong 64 still has a number of fans who still enjoy the game for what it was. Many still love the game for the prevalent charm and personality found throughout, but there are a few who would say Donkey Kong 64 was of greater or equal quality to the Donkey Kong Country series that preceded it, or even the Banjo-Kazooie series that arguably surpassed it. Perhaps it was simply an inevitability that Rare's platform games would establish such a high-quality standard that eventually it would become difficult for even Rare to match or surpass the bar that's been set by them. Donkey Kong 64 would ultimately become the last original Donkey Kong game that was released by Rare, as the years that would follow its release would see the Donkey Kong franchise step down from its high levels of success and acclaim to a period of lesser-known experimentation and obscurity. After Donkey Kong 64, Rare had already begun work on 3 more games based around the Donkey Kong universe. In 2001, these games were shown to the public at Nintendo preview events throughout the year. 2 of these games were for the Game Boy Advance. There was a puzzle game called Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers and a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing named Diddy Kong Pilot. The third game in development was for the Nintendo GameCube and called Donkey Kong Racing, another supposed successor to the original Diddy Kong Racing. There was only a concept trailer shown for this game, which featured familiar characters from Donkey Kong Country riding atop a number of classic animal buddies. However, by 2002, Rare had been acquired by Microsoft, which caused them to lose the rights to the Donkey Kong characters. Development on the 2 Game Boy Advance games would eventually resume, but instead feature Rare's original characters upon its release. Donkey Kong Racing would evolve into another game featuring a classic character from Rare, but it would never officially be released. After becoming acquired by Microsoft, Rare was still able to develop and release games for Nintendo handheld systems, though it was normally done through the publisher THQ with little fanfare. Nintendo would only publish future games for Rare on their handheld whenever it was for a re-release of their Donkey Kong Country games. When the Nintendo DS was released, Rare would continue to publish games for the system in a similar fashion. Their first game released for the Nintendo DS was a remake of their classic Diddy Kong Racing, simply known as Diddy Kong Racing DS. The game was an updated port that served as a sequel to the first game's story. Original characters like Banjo and Conker were removed since they were now owned by Microsoft and were replaced by Dixie Kong and Tiny Kong. The DS version added new tracks, touchscreen controls, a track editor, and online multiplayer. According to Lee Shuneman, he wanted the company's handheld team to learn how to design around the DS, and he felt doing that with a new game was not the right choice. However, a number of new features added to Diddy Kong Racing that took advantage of the system's touchscreen undermined the entire experience for many players. Looking back on the game, Lee Shunamin feels that Rare broke a key rule of business by putting itself before its market and paid the price with a substandard game. Still, the game did well commercially, and overall the team at Rare was happy with the final product. Diddy Kong Racing served as a launchpad and research tool for Rare. Development on the game taught them to use certain features of the DS only when it suits the experience. The lessons learned ultimately benefited their next game on the DS, Viva Pinata Pocket Paradise. Unfortunately, Rare's handheld division was closed down in 2008, so future projects for Nintendo's handhelds are much less likely to happen. In the 2000s, Donkey Kong was no longer viewed as one of Nintendo's top franchises in terms of critical acclaim or commercial success. During most of the decade, the spotlight had moved back onto the Super Mario games, the Legend of Zelda series, and the relatively new Pokémon franchise. The entire Donkey Kong Country series was ported to the Game Boy Advance by Rare during this period, but at the same time, Nintendo had begun allowing other developers to create their own games based on Donkey Kong. The first developer would be Namco, particularly the team responsible for Namco's Taiko Drum Master series. Instead of designing a game that would use Nintendo's GameCube controller, they designed a game that was intended to be played using a special controller shaped to resemble small bongo drums. Their take on Donkey Kong would result in the rhythm music game known as Donkey Konga. The game featured many returning characters from the Donkey Kong Country series, as well as popular Nintendo theme songs and Japanese pop songs. When Donkey Konga was released worldwide, the list of playable songs were altered for different regions. These new songs mostly consisted of licensed tracks that were specially recorded for the game. A second installment of Donkey Konga was made with a similar approach, though the third game in the series remained exclusive to Japan. Around the time the Donkey Konga series had begun, Nintendo had started a new initiative within the company where they sought to change the way players were able to interact with their games. 2004 saw the release of the Nintendo DS, where the focus was not on the graphical capabilities of the hardware, but instead the built-in touchscreen. In that same year, Nintendo had opened a new development studio based in Tokyo. Early signs of Nintendo's new development philosophy was seen in the studio's first game for the Nintendo GameCube. This game would become known as Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, which was a traditional platformer starring Donkey Kong that would be designed around the bongo controller. Many design elements that were considered common since the Donkey Kong Country games were either removed or changed entirely. According to the director of the game, Yoshiaki Koizumi, the decision was intentional as he felt that the past look of Donkey Kong was no longer fresh enough for today. For many, this change in art direction seemed like Nintendo's attempt at distancing themselves from Rare's legacy following their breakup in 2002. While the game was well received critically, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat was a commercial failure in North America. The game's development studio and director would go on to design the next Mario game for the Nintendo Wii, Super Mario Galaxy, which shared many similar gameplay elements originally from Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. Another developer chosen to work on new games based on Donkey Kong was Payon, a small-time Japanese studio composed of former staff members of the recently bankrupt company Data East. Their first game based on Donkey Kong was for the Game Boy Advance entitled DK King of Swing. It featured a new art style for the Donkey Kong Country characters and featured gameplay that was similar in design to the classic NES game Clu Clu Land. The controls for the game were very limited as it only required the player to use the Game Boy Advance's L and R buttons to control Donkey Kong throughout the game. Despite not receiving any marketing at all, the game was still a moderate success. A sequel followed for the Nintendo DS called Donkey Kong Jungle Climber, which brought back the classic pre-rendered visual style. One final Donkey Kong game released by Payon was Donkey Kong Barrel Blast. It was a Donkey Kong racing game that was originally developed for the Nintendo GameCube, where it would use the system's bongo controller. However, that version of the game was cancelled and it was moved on to the Nintendo Wii, where it would use that system's controllers instead. Support for the bongo controllers were scrapped for this version, and the game was poorly received critically and commercially. For an entire decade, it seemed as though the Donkey Kong franchise had languished with fewer commercially successful games than the years that preceded it. Many fans had begun viewing Donkey Kong as becoming simply relegated to obscure titles and cameo appearances in a number of Mario-themed games. However, in 2008, Shigeru Miyamoto of Nintendo wanted to create a new game starring Donkey Kong and was looking for a developer to work on the project. Longtime Nintendo producer Kensuke Tanabe suggested they appoint Retro Studios to work on this game. Tanabe recalled that the CEO of the Texas-based studio, Michael Kalebaugh, had worked on the Donkey Kong Country series while he was employed at Nintendo of America and recently told him he wanted to work on the series again. According to Nintendo president Satoru Iwata, it seemed as though the developer was destined to work on this project. At E3 2010, it was revealed to the public that Donkey Kong would be making a return in a brand new game that would pay tribute to the series once created by Rare. The game was titled Donkey Kong Country Returns, and it was developed with the intention to invoke nostalgic feelings with its art style and sound, while also providing new gameplay experiences. Kenji Yamamoto was responsible for the music in Donkey Kong Country Returns and rearranged many of the original tracks composed by David Wise. When David Wise learned that his original themes were being used to represent the game, he was reportedly very humbled. Donkey Kong Country Returns succeeded on its promise, and the game was well received by critics and longtime fans of the franchise. The game would go on to sell more than 5.5 million copies worldwide, making it not only Retro Studios' most successful title, but also the second best-selling Donkey Kong game behind only the original Donkey Kong Country. The Donkey Kong games developed by Rare have come to represent many of the most significant moments for the company throughout its history. When the series arrived on the Super Nintendo, it introduced Rare to the gaming world as a bold new force of creative talent. With Diddy Kong Racing, it showed a glimpse of the various games and genres the company would be capable of going forward. But by the time Donkey Kong 64 was released, it seemed that Rare had reached a point where their new games would always become overshadowed by their past works. While Donkey Kong 64 was still one of the most successful games they ever made, it was also the last game where the hype would match its commercial success. After the reaction to Donkey Kong's last outing with Rare had soured in many people's minds, it seemed as though the Donkey Kong franchise would forever remain a part of Nintendo's past success. Despite many of Rare's Donkey Kong games being ported numerous times, Donkey Kong 64 has never seen a similar re-release. But with the success of games like Donkey Kong Country Returns, the future of the franchise appears to have become much brighter. While the game is still beloved and defended by many fans to this day, the reception to Donkey Kong 64 marked the beginning of the difficult years Rare would have ahead of them. Next time, in Part 8 of this Rare Retrospective, Rare develops a new original franchise that combines the world of covert organizations with political intrigue and science fiction influences. It would mark their return to the first-person shooter genre and introduce the world to the secret agent known as Joanna Dark.